Hi, and welcome to Freelance Frontiers, a weekly conversation navigating the future of flexible work. I'm Ray Hames, an agency expat, brand side leader, and former freelancer myself. And I'm here with Nick Hammond. Say hey, Nick.
How's it going?
Who is a career freelance creative turned coach. We're here to chat about both sides of the freelance relationship, and we hope our listeners will find something in here that helps them smooth out the bumps along the road working with and as freelancers.
And as always, if you have any feedback, insights, questions, or would just like to join us on a future episode, drop us a DM. You may have heard our last episode where we talked about finding and onboarding freelancers, but today we're going to be focusing on trust.
Yeah, and to dive right in, I think it's worth talking about from the start just how important trust is in creating a productive work atmosphere and one where everybody feels like they have the autonomy and support they need to do their best work. It takes a lot of work and intentionality to create that type of atmosphere in any setting, but definitely as we've more and more shifted towards remote and hybrid teams, it's even harder to build and reinforce. Let's get things started. Nick, what are your general thoughts on trust and motivation, especially as a freelancer?
Yeah, for me, I think trust is the biggest thing. I think motivation for me is a little more intrinsic. I don't necessarily look to the roles that or the people that are hiring me to provide that sort of thing. But definitely trust. And I think it can be difficult because when you're getting onboarded and you're kind of starting a new relationship that's more deeply entrenched through that kind of work or project that's bringing you together, it can be hard because a lot of times small gestures over time are the thing that tend to build up trust. And so I think a lot of times there's things that you can do up front to kind of lay a good foundation. But overall, I think there's a lot of things that you have to do in small increments and over the course of many months to really make sure that you're building that up on both sides of the fence.
Yeah, and I think there's such a spectrum of trust as well that I think is worth talking about, where there's kind of basic building blocks, right? Like, do I think that my project manager is telling me the truth when they talk about the
Mm-hmm.
priority of the work that I'm working on, or the budget that I have to work with, like super fundamentals? And then there's trust, kind of a second tier of this, where it's like, how much autonomy do I have as a freelancer to bring a
Mm-hmm.
solution to the table? Like, how much does a client team trust me to figure it out? And that's where I think work can get really interesting. I think that when I think about trusted motivation, there's like tasks. It's like, okay, I've got a client where I'm hired to do task level work, and I trust that the brief that they've given me is what they need. Maybe they're not giving me a lot of rope,
Yep.
to do more thoughtful work, for example. And it's not that I don't feel like they have. Again, it's not that I don't feel like they're lying to me, but that not having a sense of that of trust and capability, I think, is a good way of putting it, makes me personally less motivated to bring that type of thinking to the table. I think that when I'm working with a team that says, "Hey, we just know that you've got a lot of experience in this category," or "We know that this is how your brain thinks. Can you help us solve this?" I feel that's my intrinsic motivation, to kind of tipping point to say, "Yeah, I can't. This is what I'm good at. This is how I can show up and help and maybe drive the ball, forward down the line in a way that both I'm excited about and hopefully is more meaningful to the project at hand."
Definitely. And I think the other interesting point too is, at least for me, after that point and getting that sort of kind of upfront information from a client, uh, it does make me more excited and motivated to get in there off the bat and does build trust. But then I also think there's kind of a fork in the road after that, where depending on how they back up that information, you can either kind of completely light that trust on fire in one, swoop, or you can really reinforce it by giving the freelancer the space to really execute on the things. And so I think that's another point here too, which is once you're in the middle of these projects, trying to figure out the balance between allowing someone the space to really execute on the thing that they were hired to do, but then also having enough check-ins so that if something is going kind of off the rails for a little bit or heading down a path that you're not necessarily needing them to go down, having those checks and balances in place just to keep people focused and on track, but then, not going overboard one way or the other.
I think that's a great point. And having guardrails on the situation is, we've both been in that scenario, but you know what I mean? Somebody leading a team or somebody on team, where somebody's given too much autonomy and the project turns into a different project. I think that that's a good point to say, and that again comes down to having a trustworthy relationship in the first place, to be able to have a conversation and say, hey, I think we're going sideways on this. Let's rein this back in. And to be able to not take that personally and say, okay, yep, I hear you, is just like a hallmark of positive communication, I think.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, and trust is a two-way street. So not only can you kind of develop that early on in the process, but I think it kind of goes back and forth on both ends or both sides of the fence, like we had talked about. So what do you kind of look for as like early indicators that maybe a freelancer is someone that you can rely on for a project?
I think this comes down to fundamentals, really, of like basic interview 101. Like, is somebody responsive? Is somebody thoughtfully replying to what your inquiries are? Are they giving you enough material to make a hiring decision? Like a lot of times you're reviewing portfolio work, or maybe you want to chat with them about how they approached a specific strategy project.
Mm-hmm.
And it's about it's just about having an open dialogue on that front, where you can start to build rapport and understand how they think, from very early days. And I think that things that have been, kind of yellow flags for me on that process of like before I've engaged somebody on a project is basic stuff like that comes down to communication and etiquette.
Mm-hmm.
Did they take a couple days to respond? And when they responded, was it a one-liner? I think that for me, trust also comes with some amount of interest alignment. So it's like,
Mm-hmm.
are they interested in the work that I'm putting up? Are they excited to be working on this with me? Because having a positive relationship from the start, we all have more motivation to bring our best selves to our work. So I think that it starts with some of those basic communication building blocks. And then, just like you said, kind of the first round of deliverables is really where you start to see like rubber meeting the road.
Mm-hmm.
And I've been in this scenario like painfully more than once, where I've had like I've interviewed somebody, I thought they were killer. They presented great great portfolio that I was like, this all looks great. And their first round comes back and it's so far from what I was looking for that
Mm-hmm.
it's like hard to know where to start to give feedback. And that's where it's like, I've been in a situation where I've felt gaslit, where I'm like, wait, did I not give you the right direct? Did I send you the wrong brief? Which piece are you responding to? And that is where, things can get really tricky, because you've engaged somebody on a project. It's up to you as a project manager to give them quality input to do quality work. And yet, if that kind of first round comes back and it's so far off base, you've really got to reestablish quickly and firmly like what the expectations are and what you're trying to achieve, because anything beyond that, if you don't get that corrected from that point, is just a waste of everybody's time.
Yeah, absolutely. So to bring it back a little bit, like kind of to the beginning of that topic, around like not necessarily onboarding, but when you're kind of trying to vet talent, um, you mentioned that the communication bit is kind of a big one for you, which I also feel the same way. When you're talking about getting a single one-liner in a response, it kind of shows that there's not as much nuance there, or like an ability to work through gray areas of projects. And then you also kind of mentioned after the fact, like once you have that checkbox ticked, that you're kind of coming into the project and getting a feel for how they can back up what they've said and the communication skills that you've kind of seen. Is there anything else that you use other than communication as, a way to vet talent as you're looking through their capabilities?
Well, I think it just depends on the role. Like I've hired people for so many different types of work, like from designers to copywriters to videographers to engineers, to SEO specialists. So there's like a really broad range of what you're really looking for. I think that the best, whether it's a resume or portfolio that you're gauging somebody's body of work on, for me, the best thing that I'm looking for is quantifiable success. So if you're a designer, what have you designed that made things go up into the right? If you're an SEO specialist, what kind of data do you have about the traffic that site traffic that your work has driven over time? Those types of things give me confidence that somebody is not only capable at their craft, but also that they understand the business context of how what they're working on ties into a larger objective. And in any role in marketing today, that's what we're all looking at. So I think that working with people who understand the context of their work helps build a foundation of trust from day one, because I don't have to explain it.
Yep. Hit the ground running.
Yeah. Like on the flip side, as you're looking at potential new clients, what gives you an idea if they're going to be somebody that you can work with productively and that you feel like you can bring your full self to the table and also trust them to be a kind of quality client for you?
Yeah, I think your answer on the flip side is kind of the same answer that I would give on the freelancer end too, which is like I tend to ask a lot of questions up front about their previous work relationships to figure out, specifically for me as a creative or on the design side of things, it's like, did you work with someone else in this capacity before? If so, what went right? What went wrong? So I can kind of understand, where this person may have gotten frustrated in the past, what topics might be difficult to kind of navigate as we're getting through things, but then also, what looks like a win and what is going to start to frustrate them if it goes down a different path. So I tend to kind of like lead with that sort of thing to get a feel for where they're at and what experiences they've had, because it helps me kind of navigate that like communication aspect of the working relationship a little bit easier. But I think it also helps me to tease out like, where is their focus being placed in their role? What led to them wanting to bring me on? And then like, is there overlap there or not? Because that can also give me a feel for, what we were talking about with if they're going to tend to want to check in a little more often, or if they're going to let go of the reins a little bit. Asking some of these questions up front with how they've handled past relationships can really help you to understand, okay, they maybe didn't trust this person in this other role because they didn't deliver. That usually means that they're probably going to hammer me pretty good on check-ins to make sure that I'm not doing the same thing.
Yeah, that's their experience that they're coming from. And, I think that there's definitely times, like, let's be honest, there are times where people just drop the ball, and maybe it's through no fault of your own. Maybe some things come up, but like, there are times where none of us are perfect, in those situations, like how for you, I imagine it's few and far between.
I'm flattered.
In general, how would you advise people to go about winning back trust after messing something up?
Yeah. Usually I try and kind of get ahead of this. So I think my first answer is maybe not going to be the answer that people want to hear, but it's doing enough work and stacking up enough chips in your favor so that when that does happen, you have this, huge swath of work behind you to point to say, this doesn't happen often. That way, it feels like a drop in the water to the person that you're working for. And it doesn't feel like, oh, this is a thing that happens often. So I think upfront, it's just getting ahead of it and proving to them that that is something that does not happen a lot. But then I think on the flip side, it's also shining a light on a lot of the other things that are going well within the process. And I think it's kind of a similar process to making sure that they see that you're able to deliver on a lot more than just this one thing that got messed up. But it's kind of in a slightly maybe like the other side of the coin kind of thing. But yeah, I think it's making sure that you've shown them that there's enough on the other side of what you're doing for them to really know that that's not something that's going to happen often. But then after that, it's just making sure that you're working to right that specific situation. And I think between the two of those, you can usually mitigate something that's not necessarily going right, because they know like, okay, they're trying to make this specific instance work and fix what happened. But also that this isn't something that happens a lot.
Yeah. And I would add to that, it kind of depends on the issue at hand. I think that there's little screw ups and there's big screw ups.
True. Very true.
Like delivering something a day late in the in a specific context can be catastrophic,
Mm-hmm.
where others it's not a big deal at all. You know, and I think that knowing the scope, like the extent of the impact is really important, because that should be proportional to how you address it. You know,
Mm-hmm.
I think I'm all for owning our mistakes and saying that's on me, let me get that solved and move forward, and really focus on you got to acknowledge it, and you've got to really focus on the moving forward piece. I think that certainly as a freelancer, when you have looser ties to a team and a manager, you got to be thinking about, you know, for every, it is stacking chips, right? For every chip that, you know, is a sideways move or something bad that goes on, you've got to stack 10 in your favor, because
Yep.
you don't necessarily have the strength of those interpersonal relationships or the day-to-day just context of like, sorry, you know, I got in a fender bender this morning and was late to this meeting. You know, it's like there's not necessarily that same wiggle room. And so I think that for me, when I've had people on my team, you know, mess something up or underperform, it's about saying sorry, saying like,
Yep.
I acknowledge that this is an issue, and then really recognizing the progress that they're making to correct it. And if you don't see that correction, if you don't see the elbow grease that needs to go into getting that solved, that's where I think that trust can break down over time. Because, you know, fool me once, shame on me, fool me twice, shame on you. I feel that pretty strongly. As a remote freelance manager, where,
Yeah.
you know, you've got to, it's on you to manage a project. And if you let everybody kind of make excuses along the way, your project's never going to get done. And so I think that there's that perspective that I have to keep in the back of my head, certainly as I'm managing a team and when I'm participating on one, to understand and own up when things go sideways.
Yeah. I think to me too, on the freelance end, that looks like ownership, even if, you know, you maybe aren't necessarily told that you have a level of ownership. And I think, you know, in some of the
Right.
context that you've provided, which is like, you know, let's say something silly happens where you got in a fender bender. To me personally, I think this is what separates someone who can really be trusted and a good freelancer versus one that isn't, is you got into the fender bender and you're going to deliver on time anyway, even if it means that you have to put in more time to make sure that it works. Because a lot of times, for me and what I've seen, delivering on time is almost the first step to making sure that people trust you with larger things. And I think if you're allowing timelines to slide often, I think that's almost one of the first signs on the client end of like, I'm not going to bring this person back on for something else in the future.
Yeah, I would say I would agree with that slippery slope.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely.
Well, I think that's all the time that we have for today's chat. For any listeners, if you found this useful or not, follow us here and over on LinkedIn for more tips on how you can get the most of working with and as freelance talent. Take care, Nick.
Bye-bye.